Welcome everyone to today's Reactor session this afternoon. Well, depending on where you're joining from, it may be the morning for you, but you're very welcome to today's Reactor session, which is enabling cloud magic by using Azure DevOps pipelines release gates. So this session will run through over the next 60 minutes. And you do have the opportunity to ask questions throughout. There is a Q&A window in which you can ask your questions, and also any comments that you have during the session, please feel free to drop them in there. Just to make you aware that this session is being recorded and it will be made available on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel by the end of this week. Once that is live, I will send out the link to the video on the meetup group where you RSVP'd for today. So just to walk you through our code of conduct. So this is really just to remind everyone that it's an inclusive environment today, to be kind and respectful to one another over the next hour. So just a reminder to be welcoming and be aware of others and be kind overall. So my name is Emma. I will be moderating today's session and I run the Microsoft Reactor in London. And so I'll be helping out with those questions today and helping our speaker with those too. And just to give you a brief introduction to our speaker today, we're delighted to be welcoming Peter de Tenner. Peter is a Azure Technical Trainer with Microsoft. Really looking forward to having him here today, and I'll hand over to Peter to kick us off.
Thank you, Emma, for the nice introduction, and thank you for having me as well. And to the audience from wherever in the world you're connecting, or if you're watching this later on as a recorded session, I'm more than happy to be here for you. And feel free to reach out during the session if you're participating live. I would say make use of the Q&A. I'll check back every now and then, and we do have about 10 minutes foreseen all the way at the end to come back to your questions. For the ones who are joining in later on and watching this as a recorded session, feel free to reach out. I'm typically a bit more active on Twitter than other social media platforms. I'm not on Instagram or Snapchat. I'm getting too old for that, but email could still work as well. And that's petender@microsoft.com. So to somehow set the scene a little bit, what I'm doing. So as you heard, I'm an Azure Technical Trainer. And what it means is that my day-to-day job is providing workshops, roughly 40-hour weeks, to larger Microsoft customers and partners from all over the world. Before COVID, it was mainly the EMEA region, traveling to customer side, to partner sites, and providing the workshops on-prem, where now it's obviously all shifted to virtual deliveries. And the main benefit, to at least try and come up with something positive around COVID, is that we're not just talking to EMEA customers anymore, but actually having folks from all over the world joining in. Besides the training day-to-day job, I'm also still providing some Azure knowledge, if you want, out of writing books, white papers. Was an Azure MVP for 5 years, but I had to give that up once I joined Microsoft somewhere last year, and a Microsoft certified trainer in meantime a bit more than 12 years. That's about me, but it's more important about walking you through the session. And for the ones who are new to DevOps, I'm just gonna quickly set the scene around what is DevOps, and eventually moving over to the release pipelines and allowing you to use the technology to actually run your deployments. Now, what is DevOps in short? It's not really a product. It's not about using a tooling, although to enable DevOps in your organization, you're probably gonna use some tools like Azure DevOps could be just one of them. But DevOps in general is more like a guidance, a best practice, a mindset even, that allows you to union people, so your technical teams, the developers, operations teams, security teams, where you might have heard about Sec DevOps as well, which mainly means that from the deployment cycle of your applications and workloads, that it's literally bringing all teams together. Next, you're going to work towards a centralized, automated, optimized process. And in the end, you're going to release a product where for each and every organization, it could be a bit different. A product could be deploying software, could be deploying a workload, could be deploying Azure infrastructure or on-prem deployments or using any other cloud platform. And all this in the end to optimize your organization, your business, your partner model, making the life of the technical teams a lot easier, and at the same time, reusing technology to enable business optimization as well. And I'll share some other examples throughout the session. Now, the other misconception every now and then is that DevOps is way too hard to get started. And I hope in this next 50-something minutes, I can show you that it's actually not that hard to get started. And the other important part, once you have this mindset, this process in place, it means that it's also a continuous journey. And that should only be a good thing. Now, what it means to have this continuous journey, it's not that every step in the process needs to be hard. So continuous means we're going to build like literally a continuous loop where in just a couple of words, you're going to start with a planning phase. That's typically the solution architects sitting together with the business teams. And from there, trying to come up with, we need to deploy, let's say an e-commerce application, maybe mapping it with some scenarios around COVID, where a lot of shops were closing down, at least in Belgium, where I'm from, totally closing down, restaurants, bars closing down. And a lot of them came up with a new business model offering takeaway meals. Now, how do you order a takeaway meal? You need some kind of web application, maybe a mobile app. So you start figuring out like, how can we transform our business? And that's the planning phase. Once you know how to build or what you want to build, like an e-commerce platform, a mobile application, we're going to decide on the platform we're going to use, let's say Azure, but it's not limited to Azure, obviously. Deciding what development language for the web application, and easy said, you're going to build or create your solution. From there, you're going to run some testing. Think of like a Q&A dev and test scenario, and eventually you're going to package everything. And that's typically the work that the developers have been doing for so long. So the left part of the process is typically developers, where now you receive a package, and depending a bit on your background, it could be that for a long time in your maybe on-prem environment or even in public cloud, doesn't really matter. Your developers are providing you like a zip file, like, hey, please, here is my software, here is my web application, my database, everything, and handing it over to the operations team. It's going to be on the right-hand side, where the operations team is responsible for the release, which means we're going to move it into a running state, which could still be dev and test. It could still be quality assurance, like a Q&A environment. It could be canary deployments, could be early adopter versions, and eventually a full production environment. Once it's running, you're going to move it to a monitoring state, where you're going to validate how the system is working, how many users are connecting, is there any peak usage. Let's say in a takeaway meal scenario, you probably have a lot more visitors to the website or the mobile app between, I don't know, 5 p.m. and maybe 9 in the evening, but probably somewhere the middle of the night, nobody's ordering anything because the restaurant is closed anyway. But every now and then you could also have peak usage because of holidays. I can imagine that with upcoming Christmas holidays, nobody's really looking forward to prep a meal because you're not really coming together with the family anyway. And that's where you could see a spike in the deployments or a spike in the monitoring, which means you have to go back to the architect table. So from the monitoring, we're going to move back to the planning state, like, oh, we need more compute power because we're seeing a spike from 50 users every night moving up to 100 users, 500 users, just some numbers. From there, you're going to revise testing the app again, packaging it again. The ops team is going to release it, monitor, and that's that continuous motion. So that's, I would say, DevOps in a nutshell. It's obviously a little bit harder than that, and it could become a lot more complex than that. And one of the complexities is, like, where do we get started? Now, if you looked at a pretty long title for the session, it's around Azure DevOps. Now, does it mean that it's the only tool you could use? Probably not. There's a lot of other tools available that help you in running your deployments against your environment, which could be on-prem cloud, it could be public cloud, so it doesn't need to be Azure. Even out of Azure DevOps, there's no real limitation on the target platform you want to use for hosting your applications. Now, if you look at, or you think back about the whole cycle that I explained on the whiteboard, there's actually quite a lot of different actions involved. It starts with the planning stage. You could translate that to project management. That's where you're going to decide on what's my technical team going to look like, together with sales teams, together with marketing teams, where it could become interesting from a DevOps perspective to know that if you send out like a marketing activity where you're going to send a bulk email to 3,000 potential customers around London, I don't know, and you're going to invite them over to your restaurant to order some online meals, and in return you get like a £5 discount, that could have some impact on your running systems. So that's where the project management comes in. And in Azure DevOps, we're talking about Azure boards. So that's the project management plugin, allowing you to create tasks, to create issues, and you can reuse those to make your pipelines more intelligent, which by the end is the core topic of the session. Once you have your project tasks in place, you're going to move to Azure repos. That's where you're going to store your source control. So it could be software, source code, could be Azure templates, Terraform templates, CloudFormation templates, for example, if you're using AWS. And once you have all the source code in place, you're going to run testing, you're going to store artifacts, which by itself could be the packages, or if you have, let's say .NET, that's an example I'm going to use in my deployment. You have a .NET application, it means you're going to use NuGet packages. If you have Java, you're going to use Maven packages, NPM for Node, that's the Azure artifacts. And then obviously moving the package into a running state, what I call the release before, can be moved into Azure pipelines. So that's where we're going to build our CI/CD concept, so the continuous integration, continuous deployment, which means that whenever a developer or an operations person is checking in code, making changes to the source, that it could trigger a new build where you're going to compile the software, and from there you're going to move it into a release, which means you're going to push it out and run it on the platform. Now, if you don't want to use everything immediately out of Azure DevOps, because it might be overkill, but most probably because you already have other tools available, then Azure DevOps doesn't really care about it, which means if you don't like Azure boards because you use another tool, just some names here, Jira, it's not the only integration, obviously, but it's a super popular tool that can be used for overall DevOps project management. And out of Azure DevOps, nothing blocks you from integrating, for example, Jira as the project management and not even using Azure boards. Or if you don't have Azure repos experience yet, but for example, using an on-prem Git enterprise server, or you use GitHub, you could also use that as a source control scenario. And a couple of other ones, but just a few easy examples here. main benefit obviously is, I would say, the openness, the flexibility of the platform. So a quick walkthrough from each and every of these, and it's not just doing any, I would say, marketing around Azure DevOps, but it's really how, back to the core topic of the session, how can each and every of these plugins, these components within Azure DevOps as the solutioning, how you can reuse them to make your pipelines more intelligent. So the first, Azure Boards, project management, allowing you to create work items, issues, doing bug tracking, for example, allocating them in sprints and moving to backlogs. That's the main idea. Azure Repos, source control. So if you're a bit familiar with Git integration or GitHub for the open sourced community alike model, although you could also use it for private projects, but super popular for community alike scenarios. Azure Repos is 100% Git compatible, which means you can start with a single developer working on your code, and from there inviting other developers or operations teams to work on the same project, work on different projects, checking in code, committing changes, running pull requests. That would be the main idea. From there, we're going to pick up the code and moving it into a build validation. If you think back about my example, .NET, I have my application running on Visual Studio, or for example, VS Code, Eclipse, IntelliJ, the development environment doesn't really matter anymore. And out of that Azure Repo source control, we're going to create our pipelines, where the pipelines can be a build stage where you're going to compile the software, validating if everything in there is okay, running some smoke testing, functional testing in an automated way could be another option, or moving to a release pipeline, where again, you're going to publish the workload, publish the Azure templates, publish the Terraform templates, and running your application in, or moving the application into a running state. Then extending with test plans and artifacts, where you're going to find the library of all your packages. So that's a little bit what DevOps involves and how it lands in Azure DevOps as the tooling. So let me switch to my DevOps environment and walk you through some of the topics that I talked about earlier. So Azure DevOps by itself is quite easy to get started. You connect to dev.azure.com. You sign in with a Microsoft account, or if you already have an Azure subscription, you could start with the same account, obviously assuming you have the correct permissions to do so, and you can create a new project, where a project is your placeholder for everything that I talked about before. So this could be the Reactor demo, and you can specify who gets access to your projects. So it could be public, interesting for like user group projects where you might just have anyone from anywhere in the world helping you in building up your workload, or maybe looking into projects, helping with building pipelines. That's the idea. From a corporate business perspective, you're probably going to use enterprise, and that means you can invite anyone from your Azure Active Directory tenant or on-prem Active Directory. And private means that you're going to decide who's becoming a member of your project. Next, you can define your source control, where we obviously recommend Git, but if you come from like Team Foundation Server, the predecessor of Azure DevOps, even before Visual Studio Team Services, you could still do that. And the work items, that's where you're going to decide on the project management and what kind of development cycle you want to use. Scrum is an important one, Agile is an important one, and nothing blocks you from coming up with your own, for example, PDT Agile solution. Once the project kicks off, it's giving you access to all features. So by design, you have the boards, the pipelines, the repos, everything, and it's obviously up to your DevOps team, typically the Scrum Master or the Agile team, operator to figure out like what are all the solutions we're going to use. Now I already prepped my demo environment to just speed up the demo a little bit. And from here, we can start working on the different items. So following the DevOps flow, I'm going to create a couple of work items. Let's start with an issue. And my issue is a little lag in Teams streaming, something I discovered yesterday. So they want me to look into that. The nice thing is that I could use Azure DevOps for a lot more project management scenarios than just publishing software or publishing application workload. So that's just what I want to show you here. Maybe mapping it with a bit more Azure DevOps related scenarios. We're going to create a new task, and the task is publish the e-commerce web app to Azure. And it means check software build, run dev and tests, and run production, something like this. And we already know that Peter will be the one who needs to pick up that item, and it's a to-do for now. Way cool. And a lot more than this. I mean, just a quick introduction. Next, we have source control, where I can start from my local machine. From here, I would clone to, for example, Visual Studio Code, one of the best editors in my opinion. If you're still using Visual Studio, because there's still a lot more capabilities, features available, or that's the standard you use, or again, because Azure DevOps is a Microsoft product, it doesn't mean that it's limited to Visual Studio or VS Code. Even if your development environment is not in this list, you could still integrate as long as it recognizes Git integration. So from here, you select Visual Studio. Obviously, that's what I already did. And picking up my web application. I'm using the default next finish .NET Core sample app, so it's just a basic static web app. It's not about the application, it's obviously about how we can make our pipeline deployments a lot more intelligent. So I'm using the reactor. Let's make a little change here. Reactor updates using CI/CD. From here, it's detecting that I made some updates in my index HTML file, and this is updated to reactor live session, and pushing out from my local development station into Azure DevOps. And I'm not going to close it for now because every now and then it's taking a little while. Confirming the push. And if all goes fine in my source control, looks a little bit different. Index. It's not updated yet, and I hope that my syncing will actually come through. Should be okay here. And it's in progress, so it is at least doing something. That's good. From there, I'm not going to wait. I can reuse my old packages. So from there, as you can see, it's already running a build pipeline. Now, how does it work? That's the CI part, the continuous integration. And what it means is that once you have your build pipeline, I'll show you the details in a minute, you could even make it more intelligent, more automated by enabling a little setting that I'll show you. And that's going to allow you to automatically compile, build your new package, your new software, or new Azure templates, or CloudFormation, or any other artifact you want to create in an automatic way. So let me switch back to the pipelines and showing you what's behind it. So my application is .NET. In meantime, I'm using .NET 5. It's released like 2 weeks ago at the .NET conference. And out of the Azure repos, it's grabbing all the source files, running them through package flow, 100% identical to what Visual Studio would do. But now you need to tell your backend system, which is defined as Azure DevOps agents, which by design is an Azure running virtual machine, running Windows Server 16, Windows 19, Ubuntu different versions, and macOS, to obviously again support a lot of other platforms besides Microsoft technology. From there, you need to instruct the build agent what the agent needs to do. So it's going to grab the source files. That's what we do in step 1. From there, use NuGet, run NuGet restore, build, which means compile my app, and eventually publish the artifact. From here, I could trigger this in a manual way. And just by using this little frag, that's my first optimization of the pipelines, making them more intelligent, smarter, I can enable continuous integration, which means any change in the source code out of repos or any other Git compatible scenario you're using, whenever there's a new change coming in, it's creating a new build. From here, it becomes even more exciting because building is one thing, but eventually we all want to see our application running in action, right? And that's what we call a release pipeline. Now, there's some updates happening, I would say, in the DevOps tooling world, where what I showed you before in the build pipeline, it's all graphical. It's using the GUI, a nice list of tasks. And from there, you can literally click around, search for it, and injecting it as part of your pipeline. The other scenario is using YAML. Now, what is YAML? It's a configuration language where you're going to build a configuration script, like a setup instruction sequence, based on a YAML syntax text file. Now, knowing that Azure DevOps is coming from Visual Studio Team Services, coming from TFS Server, where YAML didn't exist yet or not really being used quite a lot, it means that now with Azure DevOps, you're somehow, I would say, in between the two worlds. So you can still use what we describe as the classic editor, but you could also move to YAML, and even migrating from one scenario to the other is also possible. Which means that once you start using YAML, we see some kind of motion where the build and release are typically combined in what we call a multi-stage pipeline. And I'll show you that in one of my next demos, how that works. Now, what is the release? It again supports different languages. I'm using .NET, but it supports Java, Node, Python, doesn't matter. You can start from pre-configured templates, like in my example, I'm using Azure App Services because I have my little web app and eventually I want to run it on Azure. And instead of starting from scratch, I could create one or reuse one of those templates. I could pick up a build artifact. I could build a pipeline based on a Docker container, for example, or why not integrating with other artifacts from somewhere else, like Git or GitHub, public source code, or maybe integrating with Jenkins. That's another option. And from there, running your deployments. So what it looks like, just to speed up the process a little bit, and I'll show you in a live demo as well. You build the release pipeline. You select your artifact. That's the outcome of your build scenario. From there, you define the stage where I'm going to use a development environment and a testing environment. And from there, moving into production, completing all the settings, where you identify the target environment and eventually see everything running. So let's move to release. Worst case, I have 2 backup scenarios, but let's try something live. I'm going to use the app service deployment, pre-configured template, and we're going to move to the dev stage. I'm going to pick up my artifact, where the artifact is coming from the build pipeline, what I showed you before, that automated engine. Since I'm misusing my demo environment a little bit, I have a couple of different ones where obviously in a full production environment, you would select a better naming convention than what I'm doing here. I'm fine in using the latest, which means that whenever each and every developer is checking in code, it will always pick the most up-to-date one. Now you can choose if you want to use the latest one or a specific version. Some organizations allow developers to check in code whenever they want, but they always gonna move to release, let's say on a Friday night, maybe on a Monday night or any other timing that works for them. Where last, we need to define where we're gonna run our environment. This involves a connection. So depending on the target environment, you need to create a endpoint connection. In my scenario, since I'm the Azure admin of my subscription, I have access to pretty much everything I want to do. In a real life scenario, sorry, you probably want to log this down, and creating an Azure service principal would be about the same for AWS, VMware, Kubernetes environments, so there's no real limitation there. I'm deploying web apps, and from there, it's connecting to my list of Azure web apps. I already have a web app pre-deployed on Azure, just a web app instance, and that's going to be my dev environment. And finally, creating the release, and if all goes fine, it should start running. It is queued, partly because I don't pay for compute power, and also because my Microsoft internal subscription is not always picking it up immediately, although it seems to be pretty okay for now, and it is running. So we have the full monitoring, full sequence, and everything is running. I'm not going to wait for it, but we're going to make this a bit more intelligent. So back to our pipeline, where you already know out of my task, I need to run dev and test, but I also need to run production scenarios. So let's clone this. Why? Because half of the settings, if not all of them, are the same. Funny enough, because I'm using .NET, I could actually switch platforms, and I could run my testing on Windows and my production on Linux. It's the same source code, so just setting another example. And this is my Reactor prod environment. Reactor prod, there we go. I could push this out, but that's not really, I would say, the most intelligent dev and test scenario. One of the first options we have in running testing is forcing approvals. Now, what it means is that you could come in with pre-deployment and post-deployment configuration options. So let's say my dev environment, once I'm done with my dev deployment, I want someone to approve it. Think back about the starting point when you created a project. You decide who becomes a team member out of your environment. Just to keep it easy, I'm gonna allow myself to approve it. Probably not the best in a production scenario. And if you want, you could flag this option here where the user requesting the release is not allowed to approve it, but perfectly fine for my single person demos here. You can define some timeouts if nobody's approving it within 24 hours, let's say. we're going to cancel the deployment, or we're still going to run an auto deployment. So that's one option. Another scenario is where you could move to multi-stage, where this time you're going to move to the Linux dev environment. Switching over and picking any of the other ones. There we go. And from there running it again. Which now means that we have the dev stage. When dev completes, it's going to move to production eventually and moving to another dev environment. So that's not really what we want. So what we can do is defining the pre-deployment that it should run after the original build release, which now means we have our artifact coming in. The dev stage runs. We have the approval. You could also move the approval as a post step, like somebody needs to validate the package, the artifact, before we're actually pushing it out. But somehow providing you similar capabilities as a pre and post job, and adding multiple environments where if you have like canary deployments, early adopters, you would publish different versions of the artifacts. If you have multiple target environments, let's say I'm going to publish to, in my case, Azure West Europe, but at the same time, I want to push it out to UK South, UK West, want to push it out to APAC data centers, to US-based data centers, you would obviously just clone the tasks and it's going to deploy it in all different ways for you. So approval is one step, but it's not powerful enough. It's okay. The benefit is that the person who needs to approve it will receive an email, and they don't even need access to the full DevOps environment. They can literally approve it from there, or building integration with Slack, integration with Teams, for example, would be another option. Now, I mentioned that we're going to run validation, and after the dev stage is complete, we run one more powerful validation. What are the options here? Using release gates or quality gates. What it means is that we're going to inject intelligence, defining conditions under which the deployment can kick off. Let's see if we can pull it up. There we go. So for example, you can integrate with Azure policies. If you don't really know what Azure policies are, it's a governance service in the Azure platform where you can specify what are the Azure capabilities. So an easy example could be if you deploy this web app to West Europe, knowing that most of you on the call here are probably from UK, where you would assume that your business workload will run in UK data centers and not in West Europe, where now you would go like, well, that's all fine, but we're not going to allow the deployment. So you would create an Azure policy that's a pure Azure functionality. And now out of your DevOps integration, before pushing out the web app to production, it's going to validate if your policy compliance is enforced or not. If it bumps into a policy violation, like, hey, you tried to deploy to West Europe and we're not allowing it, the deployment won't even run. That's one example. Or if you're not using Azure, but you want to interact with any other platform, including Azure, running a REST API validation, you could also do that. From here, you specify, again, your connection to the target environment. In this case, it would be Azure. Reusing my service principal and running a REST API call. So if you want to validate like, hey, Azure, are you actually available? Is my web app deployed successfully, like the web app instance? Is it already there? Because otherwise, if my pipeline deploys, but the backend is not available, or there is an issue in performance, or there's, I don't know, worst case, an issue in Azure region, it means that the deployment will fail anyway. So you could make it, again, more intelligent, smarter by injecting that validation. Or why not? Let's go back to another example, running an Azure function where you could run a PowerShell script, for example, to validate the system state, to validate the health state of your workloads, to validate almost anything you want to validate before actually pushing the button. Or back to Azure Boards integration, querying work items. So I'm going to try and walk you through at least two demo scenarios. Let's do a little time check. Cool, 20 minutes. So what we can do, I'm going to disable REST API for a second and just get rid of it. There we go. Where I'm going to validate how Peter is performing. So to speed it up a little bit, it's about 5 minutes. So I need to go back to my fallback scenario, or maybe switch back after Q&A or during Q&A. The timeout is always 5 minutes. So if you try to make it faster, it's complaining that it's not possible. But from here, I can validate to check any of my that was the wrong click. Query items, there we go. Where within the query items, it can check, for example, for open issues or anything else that's open. So open issues would be a custom query, and I'll show you in a second tab what it looks like. Remember, I started with work items, and you can imagine if you have X amount of, I don't know, outstanding bugs, it probably means that there's something wrong with the software, or maybe it's fine enough for like a canary deployment, maybe good enough for early adopter for your dev and test Q&A, but not good enough for production. Where you could come up out of your project management that as long as we do have X amount of outstanding work items, bug fixes, issues, or any item type you define at the beginning of the project creation, if we have X amount of items outstanding, we're gonna block the production release. So you create a query where you're gonna filter based on outstanding items. So I have my little login teams that I need to validate, and I need to work on my pipelines. Now we're going to tell if we have any open issues, so upper threshold, let's say 1, or at least 1, we're going to block the deployment and saving it. So let's kick this up, and I'm first going to remove that Linux dev because it's going to slow down the demo, and I don't really need this step. It was just, there we go. So nice and clean. Deploy to dev, and from there move to my production environment. So the dev stage is in a queue state. It's kicking up. So let me briefly show you again the detailed logging. Everything's there. We can validate what's happening from the actual build agent perspective. So it's connecting to Azure. It's picking up this artifact, my web app zip package, and it's pushing it out into Azure World. Which means if we go to our web apps, validating the Reactor dev, I should have at least some web app up and running. There we go. Where now if I check back in my production environment, the infrastructure is there, the web app instance is waiting to be used, but there's nothing yet. So just the placeholder. So everything looks good for now. And I can see that my environment is waiting for approval. That's the first condition I defined, and all validated together with my live audience, approving it, and it's moving on. So let's refresh. It's going to be this one. And again, I'm quite bad in naming conventions, but you can see that the dev stage is complete, and now it's waiting for the gate information. So let's check what's happening. And it's validating, querying the work items, and it's failing, which by itself makes sense because you already know I do have open stuff in my query output. And that's the power of your quality gates. Now I could try and speed it up. Let's say I wouldn't delete it, but maybe flagging it as fixed. Let's see, to do, it's done, saving it. Doing something similar for the second one. Oh no, that's not gonna work because I checked on, is there an item? So we're gonna misuse our project management. The Scrum Master is probably gonna freak out now, but just gonna try and show you a successful release, although it's gonna take 5 minutes because now it's in between the validation stage where probably in the next couple of minutes, next 4 minutes, it's going to validate. Hopefully I was on time. Worst case, it's going to take another 5 minutes, and then you probably won't see the full outcome of that. One last scenario while this is running. Let me switch back to a previous scenario. So the last option I want to show you is up here, integrating with Azure Monitor Alerts. So what you can do here is, again, reading out information from Azure Monitor. Could be Azure Monitor by itself, could be App Insights, where again, out of your Azure interaction, you can specify if there's any alert showing up in Azure, where an alert can be anything based on about any metric you could come up with. If there's an alert like my virtual machine is down, or in this case, the web app is down, or maybe even from a performance scenario where you could receive information from Azure Web Apps or VMs or any other service in the platform, that if you have more than, I don't know, let's say 100 concurrent connections getting monitored out of App Insights, that could be the trigger to run a second deployment, creating a second instance of the web app, integrating it with, for example, Azure Load Balancer, application gateway-like scenarios, and creating a larger pool of servers, or in this case, a larger pool of web apps. So it's not always about monitoring when something goes wrong and blocking the deployment. It could also be used to literally enforce a deployment. So it's not negative. It could also be used as some kind of even almost like a business optimization tool. Think back about my takeaway example. If all of a sudden it's Friday night and you see a huge increase of visitors of the web app, it most probably, unless you're going to allocate a larger plan, it could probably blow up your website and making the website unavailable. So to avoid any outages, you can build intelligence like pipeline be in a wait state, and once the alert comes in, that's the green light to actually run a second or at least an additional deployment. And I think that's about it. So I'm going to keep that pipeline running and closing the deck with last couple of words. So I talked about your Manual approval, talked about the continuous integration, first of all, in the build, but more important in release, a lot of different options to make your pipelines more powerful, more intelligent. Manual approval is probably one of the most popular ones, where you could go as far as asking for multiple approvals, integrating with query work items out of Azure boards, validating Azure compliance using Azure policy, integrating third-party validation out of REST APIs would be I would say, the more open option there. Integrating with other Azure DevOps plugins. So what I'm having in my environment is Sonar Cloud. It's a source control security scanning tool. And if you're a developer coming from the development world, at least, you might know Sonar Cloud or Sonar Cube or Snyk. Similar tools doing different tools doing similar things, scanning your code before actually compiling and running release, where the scenario here could be that if Sonar Cloud, your security scanning tool, is reporting any issues like outdated code or insecure code or sharing credentials in text files, stuff like that, that it's not allowing you to actually run the deployment. Walk you through the demo scenario, and that means we're close to the end and opening up Q&A. So already important, the takeaways from the last 50 minutes is Azure DevOps is one of the tools allowing you to integrate end-to-end DevOps concepts, the mindset and the flow. It's not limited to Azure deployments, although that's what I used for the demos, but you could use it for on-prem deployments, obviously Azure deployments, Azure Stack integration, AWS, Google Cloud, any other environment. Out of PowerShell command line options would be a possibility there. It can dramatically speed up your deployments, so taking away the manual interaction, taking away the manual validation, so moving from the more intelligent build process all the way up to releases, and most important, taking control of your pipelines, partly in build, partly in release, using the manual approval, integration pre and post, and the quality gates. So with that, I'm going to open up Q&A, and we should have about 8 minutes for that. So question for Emma, do we have any questions coming up? Or did we have any questions already coming through?
Yes, Peter, we've got a few questions, so I'll run through them. So a question from Maran. I am working for a large organization. We have system integration, testing, environment, QA environment, and performance environment. How can we create these stages in the pipeline? How can we governance activities in the pipeline?
Okay, so the easiest scenario I would say is, well, partly what I showed you in one of the demos. So every stage is technically a target environment. So in this scenario, I have a dev environment where in the backend, I'm connecting to my dev target environment. And eventually I have my production, where now if you want to move to a next stage, so if this is your performance environment, the only thing you're going to change here is the target, where I could pick any pre-configured web app, or even making my pipeline more intelligent and first of all building the target environment, and when everything is up and running, moving to the actual deploy. That would be the scenario. And there's no real limitation to how many stages you're going to build. There's probably some soft limit, but I have no idea by heart what it is. But this is literally your scenario. One of the largest pipelines I think we have is Windows 10 deployment, or even Azure DevOps by itself out of the Azure DevOps team, where we're using like 50 different stages, combining them in what we call a ring, and from there running deployments. So if you use like Windows 10 preview features or preview build, every almost every week, there's a new version coming out. It's grabbing the deployment from any of the stages. So that would be the easiest scenario. And then again, for each and every stage, defining pre and post validation quality gates, that would be the way forward.
Great. Next question from Simeon. Is there any documentation somewhere, as in a share link, for this demo?
There is a couple of different options. The first one, let me pull up the link. If you go to microsoft.com/learn, it's our free learning platform. And if you search for DevOps, it's going to give you a pretty long list of not just keywords, but also different job roles, training, and what you can do from here. I'm not going to pick one for DevOps, but any other one that shows up to just provide you that answer. We provide you documentation, and we also provide you a hands-on lab scenario. So a lot of the components that I showed you in the demos are sort of similar, available in the learning plans. Another option is dropping me an email or reaching out on Twitter, PDTIT. And to prep my demo scenario a little bit, I created a Word document with some keywords and some screenshots to somehow try and squeeze everything in like 50 minutes, which was actually a challenge by itself. And if you want, I can also share the document. The idea is that I'm going to open it up somewhere on GitHub, but I didn't do that yet, so I cannot provide you the link yet. But for the ones who are watching this later on as a recording, similar to the Twitter handle, it's PDTIT on GitHub, and I'll make sure that there's a little DevOps reactor, or Reactor London, I'll call it, the repo, and dropping my screenshots and some guidelines in there.
Great. A few more questions coming through now. So Theja has asked, is it possible to automate the manual setup of pipelines using Terraform?
Actually, yes. It's something that I didn't really use myself, but only, I think, like not even a month back at the Terraform conference, they actually came up with Azure DevOps Terraform provider. So if you use Terraform for platform deployments, you can now also automate the Azure DevOps project pipeline integration, everything you're looking for out of Terraform syntax. And obviously you would use the YAML concept, which by the way, I didn't show you, but let me quickly open it up. So I showed you the classic editor, the graphical editor, but eventually what it would come up to is a YAML file where out of my two different stages, I have a build stage up here that's running that NuGet packet install, running VS build, running the build compile, and publishing the artifact. And once the artifact is published, I'm moving over to release. And that's where I'm going to interact with Azure Web Apps. Where this is a standardized open standard YAML file concept, and you could automate this from within Terraform.
Great. I'm just conscious of time, so we'll run through a couple more. Question from Josh, are there more deployment gates coming soon? I assume there are third-party deployment gates on the marketplace for ADO.
Well, first of all, so I showed you the built-in Azure DevOps release gates option. There's a couple of third-party plugins where you're actually not using the release gates out of Azure DevOps itself, but actually replacing it with third-party tools. And another idea could be like the 5-6 options that I showed you. The most open one will probably be Azure Functions, allowing you to trigger PowerShell to trigger mainly PowerShell on Azure or somewhere else, but using Azure Functions to like kick off the PowerShell script, or using REST APIs, and that would allow you to interact with AWS, Google Cloud, Docker environment, Kubernetes environment, on-prem environments to run validation.
Great. I'll take the next question from Andres. Can a use a simple repo using different branches, for example, one for iOS and Android, and deploy and create task pipelines, etc.?
That is doable. So what you can do is, first of all, creating multiple repos. So I have one project called a 425, just a name that you pick up. And from there, you can create multiple repos. So let's say my basic web app that I used is linked to a build and release pipeline, where now I could create a new one, create a new pipeline, and defining that my starting point is not the 425 repo, but it's the other repo. And from there again, moving on with build and release. So one project, multiple repos, or multiple projects, multiple repos. That's the flexibility you have. And then in the target, so the release definition in YAML or in the classic editor, it's again moving to your target. So you could start from one part of the repo connects to AWS, one part of the repo through the pipeline deploys it in Azure for like multi-cloud deployments. It's definitely doable.
Great. Next question is there a way to set up monitoring of third-party apps like Apple Pay post-release?
I don't know what that application or the target environment is doing, so I have no real idea there. But again, I would look into REST APIs maybe, or again, functions and run a PowerShell validation. That's what I typically use for like on-prem servers through like ExpressRoute or site-to-site VPN out of Azure, spinning up an Azure function and validating my on-prem systems, and REST APIs for pretty much anything else that runs outside of Azure. But I don't know the app, so I can't really confirm if they even support REST APIs or not.
Great, that's all the questions that we have, Peter.
Nice. Cool. So I'm going to close with thanking you before handing it over to Emma. And I would say thank you for, first of all, the interaction, the good questions, and I hope you enjoyed it, you learned from it. And again, feel free to reach out, stay in touch. Even if this is the recording you're watching, don't hesitate reaching out. More than happy to share some Azure knowledge. Over to you, Emma.
Great, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure to have you deliver this session with us, and I do hope we have you back again shortly. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today too for your engagement, all of your questions, and we love welcoming you all back. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you all next time. As I mentioned, this session was recorded and the link will be available towards the end of the week. Just keep an eye out on the meetup page where you signed up, and that's where I'll share that link out. So have a good evening or day depending on where you are, and see you at the next session.